Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this week's Life Conversations with a Twist. I have Mariya on today. Mariya and I just met, like 2 weeks ago, I think.
Yeah.
This is the power connections. Like I was thinking about how I was going to introduce you today, and one of the things that I always talk about is like the power connections and how the world like really like gives you these opportunities to connect with amazing women, which is why I started this podcast. And one of my past guests actually introduced you and I because of the work that you do in nonprofit world and board. And then as soon as we chatted, like we found all these other ways to connect. So I was like, yes, please be on my podcast. So thank you for being here.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you for having me.
So give our listeners a little bit about your day, who you are now, where you live, a little bit about your family life, and then we'll dive into your story.
Yeah, so my name is Mariya Yurukova, and I'm the CEO of a talent recruitment firm that works exclusively with nonprofits called Charity Search Group. And besides that, I do a whole bunch of other things, but I spent my entire career in the nonprofit space. And so this sort of is the world I live in is all about nonprofit work and sort of something that not many people get exposed to, but on its own, it's amazing how many lives are touched by various different nonprofits that do all kinds of work that we encounter on a day in, day out basis. And I think I'm fortunate enough that I get to work with many of them and help them bring about impact to the communities that they serve. I'm a mom of one 9-month-old, 9.5-month-old. He just learned how to stand up. So that sort of is the highlight of my week, if you wish. And also like the most challenging time ever because he is on the move.
Yep.
Um, and I split my time between Bethesda, Maryland, and Niagara, Canada. So I'm originally from Bulgaria, which is in Eastern Europe. I spent about 20 years in Canada, where I met my husband, who happened to be also American. And so we go back and forth quite a bit because we have family in both places.
I love that. Where are you currently at right now?
Currently, I am in Niagara, and then tomorrow I'm traveling for the great Thanksgiving move.
I saw some meme and I just had to share it. It was like something like it was like a mom saying, "Why do our kids get a whole week off for like one dinner on Thursday?" Like, it's so true. But I'm like, it gives us the opportunity to travel and take time off, so I'm here for it.
If we can, if we can, I think it's good, but I also find it because I'm like my stress level is probably up about 20% where it normally is because there's just such a mad rush towards the end of the year. And one of the things I love about nonprofits is that many of them would shut down between December 25th and January so that they don't really bring people in for 3 days in like that week in between. And so it feels like it's only 3 working days that they would be off for. But in my world, for some reason, this is creating a whole bunch of stress of, oh my God, we don't have enough time to do all these things. And everybody wants stuff to start in January. And so it's a little bit stressful. And I was like, we literally like spin ourselves into a tizzy just to get like 3 days off. But such is life.
It's like vacation, right? Everyone's so excited and needed a vacation, and then you're gone for a week and you come back and it was like it's just even more busier and you're like, why did I even take this vacation? Or even leading into it.
Yeah.
So you talked to obviously you've started this business with nonprofit, lots of them, and when you and I met, we talked about different avenues, and I can't wait to dive in more. But tell us like how you even got into this space, like kind of like what was your first job and kind of like what led your path there.
Yeah, so there's so much to this, right? So the thing about the nonprofit space, which sort of explains why people like me exist to begin with, is that most people don't go to school thinking they will end up working in the nonprofit space, right? Nobody really says, "Oh, I want to be a professional fundraiser and help people fund scholarships." Like, I don't think there's a single university student or high school student thinking that right now. But so that informs the fact that there isn't really a talent pipeline for nonprofit professionals that sort of can feed the talent needs of the nonprofit sector, which is ever growing and ever expanding, right? So I fell into it just like everybody else. Like, you go on one path and you think this is what you're going to do, and then you get exposed to a great organization that does amazing work, and there's like a light switch goes on and you're like, this is what I want to do because it fills my cup, right? And that's how I started, and things were going great and everything was sort of, I had this like very uh like structured career path I was on, that I was okay, now I'm going to be a manager and I'm going to be a director and then I'll be an assistant vice president, and I had like this whole plan. And then early in my 30s, I had to go to the doctor to renew my control prescription, which seemed like it was literally one of those like appointments that you just have to go and like be like, okay, just give me the paper and then I'm done kind of thing, right? And I happened to ask the question of the doctor, who happened to be not only someone who can write that prescription, but also happened to be a fertility specialist. And so I was like, oh, by the way, I'm in my early 30s. I think I'm going to have children soon, but I don't know, like, what's my runway? How long do I have? And he was like, well, there's this one test that we can run that will tell you what your ovarian reserve is going to be. Um, and I was like, he was like, it's not usually covered by insurance, but it's like $75. And I was like, yeah, okay, well, I would like to know. Um, and so I did the blood work for the test, and then the results I think were going to come like the week later. And I was like living life and like doing all those kinds of things. I was renewing my birth control prescription, and I go back to get the results, and the doctor is like, so remember how you asked me what your runway is? And he was like, 2 months. I was like, ah. I was like, but I'm on birth control. And he's like, well, you have diminished ovarian reserve. Your ovaries are about a decade older in terms of the way they perform than what your actual age is. And so you will run out of genetic material, so to speak, um, sooner. And so if you plan on having children, you better do it yesterday. Which is not like when you get a news like this, especially when it's not something that you like are actually working on or planning for in a serious way. It really sort of was like one of those. I think it took me a while to be like, oh, so what does this mean? And I
Mhm.
think I was lucky that I was with a partner who was very supportive. I was like, well, we're just gonna like roll with it and figure out what's going to happen. So one thing led to another, and then I ended up in a whole bunch of IVF treatment cycles, which were not covered by my employer. And as many of you or listeners probably know, they can be quite pricey. And so I was like, I need something to supplement my income, so that I can continue to do the work that I do, but I can also pay all these medical bills. And I remember that I had worked with a recruiter in the nonprofit space for a job that I did not end up getting about a decade before that. And so I called up the recruiter and was like, hey, by the way, like, I know the nonprofit space really well. I'm good at hiring. I manage a lot of people. Like, do you need some help? And he's like, funny you should ask. And so one thing led to another. And then I ended up with this side gig where I was doing recruitment on the side of my full-time job in order to pay for my fertility treatments. And I happened to really like it. And I thought that this gave me an opportunity to impact so many more organizations than just the one I was working for, which I think really got me excited. And sort of understanding, because if you can get access to talent, that I feel like especially for growing organizations, that's the biggest hurdle. Like if you can figure out how to hire better, then you can have bigger impact. And when you are impacting um, organizations that really sort of have a profound impact on families and communities, I think getting them better access to talent is really fulfilling.
Mhm.
Uh, and so then the pandemic happened. Nobody was hiring for anything. And so what does one do when there's no work? You start a company. um,
Which is what most people did during this time.
right.
Yeah.
And so here we are 5 years later. I think Charity Search Group is turning five in 2025. We've had over 135 placements in the nonprofit space, and we've worked with more than 60 organizations. And I'm very lucky and I think very proud that many of them are returning clients for whom we've staffed entire teams across the country in 20 states plus. We continue to work with many of our early on clients, and along the way, I think we've picked up many others, and we now are a team of 10 that we collaborate on this great work. So that's the twist. That's how we ended up here, and here we are on
I love
November.
that. I actually probably, I would say a lot of my listeners are in the nonprofit sector. Can you talk just a little bit about what your group does and what your team does specifically to help support? Is it, because there's kind of two arms. There's the hiring for the actual nonprofit team, but then also you do some board development as well.
Yeah, so we do. Um, a couple, all of these things are connected, right? So the reason why we do things like board training, so that boards understand what their role is in things like fundraising and governance and hiring of a CEO, for example, is because if I know that a board has had the capacity building and professional development in that space, then they tend to be easier to work with. And we have to do a less of a heavy lift when it comes to educating them on this is how hiring works. These are the questions you should not ask in an interview. And this is what the talent pool looks like. And no, most nonprofit professionals don't just do this for pennies because, they don't have mortgages to pay and whatnot. So those kinds of conversations, I think when we have them on the training side, it makes for a better hiring experience and it sets the hire up for success, right? The
Mhm.
essence of what we do is really help boards and nonprofits go through a leadership transition. So when a CEO is about to leave or there is a vacancy or the organization is growing and they have many senior leadership roles, we come in and we not only find the talent to fill them, but we also ask a whole bunch of questions and we take the leaders on a journey of understanding where are you today, what are you trying to accomplish, and where you're trying to go, and what kind of leader is going to take to do that, right? And so those kinds of questions and that partnership, I think, is really important and sometimes understated. So occasionally we would go into an organization that has had a long-term executive director, let's say for 19 years, or sometimes they're the founder. Um, and and look at the organization and create a path of, okay, so if and when the time comes when this leader is about to move on to their next thing, what is this going to do to your organization? Like, are your donors going to leave? Do you need a new board? Do you know everything there is to know about how you're funded and what your programming looks like? Do you have someone internally that can be an heir apparent that would come in and step into the role? And so we go through that succession planning process with a lot of organizations, independent of whether they eventually need to hire that person or not, just to get them through the process of thinking of all the moving parts. Even something simple as, if your CEO resigns tomorrow, who needs to know and when and how, right? And so like we would map out that process. So that's sort of the work that we do. I've also done a lot of consulting with nonprofits when it comes to fundraising and sort of how to amplify and really elevate your fundraising efforts where you're getting a better return on effort because a lot of fundraising is so labor intensive, which burns out staff and it doesn't always bring out the results that you want. And so I it's really difficult to get me off the track of not going into an organization and be like, so this is how you're raising your money. Here's 5 other ways to do it. But that is also something that I enjoy greatly.
That was something that I took away from our conversation was because I do support some nonprofits and where we're at in Sonoma County, there's so many nonprofits.
Mhm.
And I was really intrigued and wanting to know for you on your experience on fundraising, like everybody's like, oh, you have to do this big gala, you have to do this like big event. But something that I took away from you was like sometimes that's not necessarily what that nonprofit needs is that or there's like other things that you can do that are more profitable for them instead of doing this big expensive event, especially in Sonoma County. It's so expensive to hold an event. Can you talk a little bit through like some of the clients that you've worked with that have done things other than a big gala fundraiser?
Uh, yeah, I mean, there's so many, and like there's a place and a time for fundraising events. And I think lots of our clients are very successful in doing those, right? And raise millions of dollars in events. So yes, but then there's also things like COVID-19 happens and you can't have a gala with 1,000 people. And then what do you do, right? So a couple of other things that I've seen that have been equally or even more successful for some of our clients. One of them has really been instead of going through this like large event, which is very, as you know, effort intensive and expensive to create and all of that, and tends to sort of uh, paralyze a whole bunch of other work of the organization while the event is going on because everybody's so focused because it has a deadline and it's public, so you want to show your best foot forward and that stuff. But salon events, on the other hand, are something that many organizations are able to activate their board members on that I think are even more effective than a gala. And so the difference is that when you have a gala, there's like this huge, oh, we need to sell 300 tickets or whatever the number is, right? And then everybody tries to do that. And but there isn't really a ton of strategy or rhyme or reason, so long as you have like the warm bodies in the room, right? But what's helpful and what works really well with salon events, for example, is there you have a board member or someone who's really passionate about the organization who's hosting, you know, 15, 20 people in their home. And so it's not really a large event. It still can be elevated. It still can be very high profile, but much smaller in terms of much more intimate, I should say. But because it's much more intimate, you get to ask more questions. You get to meet with the program staff or whoever. And then you get activated as a potential donor a lot faster and a lot easier instead of in a big event where the follow up is always where things fall through, I would say.
Mhm.
And so that's like one way to still think about events, but do it a little bit differently.
Mhm.
But the majority of my clients really think about how do you activate major donors? And so how do you have access and how do you think about folks in who are most likely already your supporters? You just don't always know what their capacity for larger giving is. So
Mhm.
that's one area that's really important. A lot of our other clients do great work with when it comes to like online giving types of sometimes it could even be events, challenges, like that kind of stuff. They do great there. And then ultimately, I think where so in fundraising, there's the short-term money that you can get right away, and then there's the longer game with things like grants, for example. And so there you have to keep up. They have long cycles. So sometimes you submit something and you don't hear back from 9 months. But when you do, it could be very substantial to the organization, right? So you have to balance out what you're trying to do today versus what you're trying to do for 3 years from now. And ideally, you have the capacity to be able to do a little bit of both, right? I think that the wildest thing I heard not that long ago was from someone who had gotten the idea, and I love this story, who was traveling a lot for work. And they were like, every time I'm like lining up for check-in and like all those things, everybody's on their phones playing games. And I'm like, how do we get access to these people? And so apparently there's a way that like the Candy Crush type of games as well.
Mhm. Mhm.
Apparently there's a way that you can do ads for nonprofits while people are playing these games, I think. And just tell me that they managed to do that, asking for monthly donors, and they got like a tremendous amount of response. Now, keep in mind, it was a large organization, so they had some bigger budget to work with. But ultimately, they were able to find donors who were on their phone playing games. So I think
Wow.
the moral of the story is sometimes you have to go where the people who are interested in the work that you do are, wherever that is,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm. I love that. And I love the online fundraising because then it like reaches so many more people than just an event that is local and you're already like I feel like there's a lot of donor fatigue right now and it's like we're all kind of, trying to buy the same money from the same person or the same organization, but there's other ways to kind of expand your network and grab other money elsewhere. I love that. One last thing I want to talk about before, and then I want to come back to this, your whole fertility thing, because I think that is very intriguing to me too. Um, you talked about board, like board members could host these events. But from what I understand and what I hear a lot of is that some boards have been like they've had the same board members on there. Like, how do you re-engage and grow a board and get their buy-in still, get them to participate, or like say, thanks for your time to move on so we can get some fresh blood. Like, what is your perspective on all that?
So,
And that's a
this
lot of question.
Right. Okay, let me see if I remember all of them. But let's start there. So typically when you've had a lot of long-term board members that are kind of not doing anything and they're just there, and that happens sometimes, it's very helpful to bring someone like me that says something like, it is industry best practice for boards to have terms, and those terms usually are for 2 years plus a 2-year renewal. And so from today, we will put everyone on a term, and 2 years from now, those terms will expire. And so and then it starts to shift. Okay, so there's an end to this. This is not a given that I'm always going to be on this board. So that's one way of doing it. Ideally, you would do that before you start recruiting board members, because board jobs are just like any other job. They should have a job description. There should be a term. There should be terms of engagement, in which fundraising is one of those things you might want to put in there. But if you didn't do that and you're dealing with a whole bunch of legacy issues, then bringing in a consultant to make some of those recommendations, I think, is always helpful. Expanding the board so that if you have a board of 6 or 7 and 5 of them are not doing much for you, well, have a board of 12, right? And then gradually move people off as those terms that you just introduced start rotating, right? That's something to consider. And then the other piece to this is, which I've seen done successfully, is you look at board members and why they wanted to be on the board in the first place. And then sometimes you realize that their passion is actually not to be in governance and to read like audits and all of that. Maybe they just want to help people. So maybe transitioning them to a volunteer role maybe something to consider. So we might be able to find something about a different place for them. But typically when I've worked with boards, like on the staff side, I would meet with board members on an annual basis and be like, so how are things going? Is it still fulfilling for you? Like, do you have the time for it and all of that? And when you start asking these questions, sometimes people are like, this has been great. I feel like I want to do something else next year. And so it's helpful to also give them the opportunity for a graceful out, if you wish.
I love that. Thank you, because I know there's some nonprofits that'll be listening to take that advice.
Now,
Okay, what were you
do
gonna
you,
say?
do you want to talk about how we activate it for the purposes of fundraising?
Sure.
Okay. So, real quick, the thing about fundraising that everybody needs to remember is that it's uncomfortable. It's uncomfortable even for me, and I have done it for 20 years, and I've raised millions of dollars, and I've sat in front of people and asked them for millions. So, and it's even more uncomfortable when you think about it in the very simplistic way of I need to ask my friends for money. Like nobody likes to do that, but that is also not what fundraising is. And so I think it's really important that if you're going to activate board members for the purposes of fundraising, you need to break this down into tasks that they're comfortable with. This is how a lot of galas and golf tournaments end up being born, is because that's the least uncomfortable thing people are comfortable with.
Mm-hmm.
I could totally invite 20 people to go out for dinner with me.
Yeah.
Um, not, however, here's a couple of other things that you might want to do. And so usually when I activate a board member for the purposes of fundraising, the low threat type of work is, okay, so we've gotten gifts from these 10 people for the first time ever. Do you mind making these 10 calls and thanking them? Right? Like that's something that most people don't really feel uncomfortable doing, right? But it gives them an opportunity to talk about the organization. It fills the cup as to why people are excited about it. And then you just never know, it may inspire them to also introduce the cause to other people, right? So that's sort of the low end of what you would ask them to do. The second level of all of this is asking them to introduce you or whoever is the staff person to people in their network that might want to hear about the work that they're doing. So it kind of goes like this, like, hey, we are doing awesome work in suicide prevention. Do you know anybody in your network that is passionate about this kind of work that may be interested in the work that we do? And it could be that because you have this new research report that came out, it could be because have this new great program that you're about to launch, whatever the case is. But when you put it that way, it doesn't always mean that you're looking for, like, the last thing you want to do is be like, do you know any rich people that we can go ask for money? Nobody ever says yes to that, right?
Yeah.
And then the third piece of this is, if you do have board members who really want to ask their network for funding, for example, it's really important that you support them and make sure that they have everything they need in order to do that. So I remember working with one board member who had access to a lot of wealthy people. So the issue there wasn't that she didn't know anybody. The issue was that she was really uncomfortable asking them for funds. And I was like, okay, well, don't ask them for funds. Introduce them to me and be like, hey, I really think that you would appreciate the work that I'm doing with this organization I've been involved with. I want to introduce you to the executive director. If you have some time to spend with her, that would be great. And that's all sometimes that's all it took. So you have to gauge where people's comfort is and slowly move them up the ladder of what they're comfortable with. But it never works with like the blame game of, you must do this. Like that doesn't really work. And then the other piece to this I think is really important is that you have to set the stage with how you recruit board members. And so putting something in their invitation to join the board, for example, that says, it's really important for us that we authentically represent the organization to all of our funders and show that our board is 100% behind our efforts. And we are really firm in working towards 100% board participation and philanthropic support. Are you comfortable making, and so here's how different ways you can do this, a personally significant gift to organization X? Are you comfortable making organization X one of your top 3 charities that you support, right? That's another way. Are you comfortable committing to raising $5,000 on behalf of X charity? Like if they don't have the capacity to do it themselves, but they want to do it from hosting dinners or whatnot, that's their choice, right? And so when you put it that way in those documents, people will self-select if that's not their cup of tea. And I think that's okay.
Hmm. I love that. A board that I was on, that's what they did. They were like, you can either give or you can, give us your network and do things in different ways. And I like that because, as somebody who wouldn't be able to donate like $1 million a year, but I know enough people to like help grow or, be able to help fundraise. So I love that reminder. Thank you for that. I love this conversation, and I think that it's so good to have it, especially because there's so many nonprofits out there, and then everybody wants to start a nonprofit, and
It
yeah,
is hard work. It is not easy, but I'm also happy offline. If anyone's listening and it's like, oh, I need to work through this, whatever your board thing is, I'm happy to jump on a call and troubleshoot this or give you an ideas of what kind of services you can take advantage of that will do some of that for you.
I love that. Thank you. Yeah, we'll
Because
definitely put
boards
your
listen to me
info.
more than they listen to the executive director. I will.
They
Not
always
because I'm
listen
like,
to an outsider.
yeah,
Yeah, I love that. Okay, so you started this amazing business during the
right.
pandemic, but it also kind of became more of a side hustle because you needed passive income or you needed more income, right? So the doctor tells you you have 2 months. Were you with your husband at the time?
Yes, he wasn't my husband yet.
He wasn't okay.
We had literally just moved in like 2 weeks earlier.
And you're like, guess what?
Pretty much, yeah.
We need to speed this process up. What was your journey like? So they tell you this news. I couldn't even imagine. Like again, like you were saying, like you just go in to get birth control. This was not a conversation like you were even hoping to have, but here you are. What were next steps for you?
Well, so I think uh, at that time, that was now quite some time ago. I think what the doctor said was, okay, you have 3 months to figure yourself out. If you're not pregnant in 3 months, you're just going to have to start fertility treatments. And I can't emphasize enough how shocking that is to hear when you're not even trying to get pregnant.
Yeah.
Put it this way. Because now when someone, like, I was like, okay, well, here's the list of treatments and here's all the things you need to do. And this is the timeline. This is what genetics is going to look like. And now I can tell you so many things. But at the time, deer in the headlights does not begin to describe this. And so anyway, so that was the case. And so I found out, I think it was the week before my birthday, which is in September, in the end of September. And I think our first IVF cycle was in February. And at that point, it was unsuccessful. And then one thing led to another. And then we had to do an IVF cycle the following fall. So the thing about fertility treatments, which you may or may not know from experience, that they move very slowly. So sometimes there's many reasons as to why things take years, right? Anyway, so long story short, we kept on trying different things. We changed doctors a few times. I had an IVF cycle that was successful in terms of me getting pregnant in the following fall. So a year later, so see how things go. I did end up having a miscarriage. And at that time, I think that experience was the part where I was like, I need to find a way to do work that will support my well-being so that I can actually go through this because and then the pandemic happened and whatnot. But nonetheless, that was sort of the impetus for me to also change careers so that I would actually be a little bit more in control of my own fate. Because the one thing about fertility treatments that I think is super stressful is that, like, I remember interviewing people while I was in the waiting room in an IVF clinic because you do things like at 7, 8 a.m. in the morning, and you have to go like 4 times a week. And you can't schedule around it. It's not like your life is not your life at that point. You just go by whatever the doctor says the next appointment needs to be. Um, and so that work-life balance is very challenging during those times. Anyway, so one thing led to another. Um, we then changed doctors, and then in the middle of the pandemic, our new doctor was like, well, the only way we can solve your issue is not for you to just keep trying, because if you ever wanted to have, oh my God, more than one child, you're going to run out of time anytime now. So how about we just do IVF cycles back to back to back to back to harvest whatever genetic materials you have, and then we'll worry about getting you pregnant. I was like, yeah, okay. And so during the pandemic, while everyone was masking up and everyone is at home, I did 6 IVF cycles in 8 months, I think it was. Which is like, now I look back and I was like, I think this was a little bit insane, but it happened. Um, Anyways, long story short, then we tried to get pregnant with a couple of embryo transfers that didn't take. There was another miscarriage somewhere in there.
So
But
these were
that's
your own eggs at this point because the IVF process is
yes.
basically creating eggs that they can extract to wait until you want to be pregnant.
So there's two kinds of IVF, right? So there's the harvesting of the eggs, which is the genetic material that a woman has, and then those eggs are usually combined with the genetic material from a man, in this case, my now husband, and then they create embryos, which are sort of frozen at sort of the fifth day, for the most part. And then when someone is trying to get pregnant, those embryos are the ones that are being transferred, right?
Got it.
And so the idea with us was that, well, if we can have as many embryos as we can, we can put them on ice and then just transfer and hope that the first one takes, which it didn't. The second one didn't take either. And so we were down to 2 embryos at the time. Now this is now 3-4 years later. And now we're down to because there was some additional backup cycles that were being done to harvest more eggs. And so at that point, there was 2 embryos left that we could transfer. And our doctor was like, listen, your best chance of achieving a pregnancy, given the fact that we've not been able to keep you pregnant, we haven't been able to get you pregnant, the best thing to do for you to do is to perhaps use a surrogate. And so here goes, like, talk about twists. I was looking at like the question that you had sent me in the name of your podcast, and I was like, okay, that was the first twist, but I have like 6 other twists.
I know. This is why people come on my podcast more than once.
Right. And so the second twist was like this whole thing of, okay, so now you're going to have to work with another woman to carry your child. And I was like, okay. And
And at this
finding,
point, and I'm just curious. So, I mean, anyone listening to this knows that I was a surrogate. So this is why I'm like super intrigued to have you on because I'm on like the other side of it. And that's why I've been very blessed in my being able to get pregnant on my
right.
own. And so like I've never had to go through that. So that's why I ask these questions because I'm like, I don't even know what that process is like for you guys. But I remember like when I started like this whole surrogacy idea, like it's still very like foreign for a lot of people. They're like, wait, what? And I'm sure that's something that you never thought of. And like the only person that I could relate to was like a Kardashian who had a surrogate or whatever, right? So I'm curious to know, like in your head, where you're like, what is it that I'm about to do?
Um, yeah, I mean, the thing about me is that I like to do a lot of research. And so slowly you start getting exposed. And the thing about things in life in general is that when you open yourself up to certain things, all of a sudden you see them everywhere. And I
Yeah.
think that goes in terms of like positive manifesting the perfect parking spot at the mall for those of us who are going to be doing some Black Friday shopping. But it also goes in this space. Like I remember going to the bank, talking to a teller and being like, I need you to increase my daily transaction limit on my credit card because I have to pay bills at the fertility clinic that are more than $5,000. And my daily transaction limit doesn't allow me to do that, even if there's money in the card and whatnot. And she was like, huh, fertility treatment, eh? And I was like, yes. And she was like, I have a 7-year-old. He was the 7th transfer of my 7th, like, embryo. 6 didn't take. Um, and then we both cried at the little teller thing in the bank. So you can just imagine like the craziness that sometimes happens with these situations. But who knew that this is how this was going to come about, right? And
Mhm.
so anyways, all that's to say is that once you start thinking about surrogacy, then all of a sudden lots of people that you may or may not know tend to validate that and have had similar experience and whatnot. And so did I know that that existed? Probably. I mean, obviously at that point, I also knew a lot about how IVF worked, but I didn't know how long and how hard it would be to find a surrogate. And I didn't understand sort of what that whole process would entail, which is um, incredibly difficult for many reasons. So, and so think of it this way. So like if we leave the biology aside for a second, you have two women most of the time. It doesn't even have to be because, if you think about gay couples, then that's a different set of circumstances. But for the most part, you have two women who are coming, like you and I, for example, we're coming from the exact opposite end of the spectrum when it comes to fertility. You have been deemed to be good as a surrogate because you've had easy breezy pregnancies. Mm-hmm. And I have been deemed to need a surrogate because I've had nothing but trouble in that space. Mm-hmm. And so when we go through that entire process, for you, everything is normative, things are going to go okay. And for me, everything is normative, things are not going to go okay. And when we start going through this process together, it's incredibly difficult because like intended parents are perpetually in a waiting for the other shoe to drop mode. And so as you go through particularly early stages of pregnancy and all of that, we have to relive our trauma for all of that, right? And surrogates sometimes are like, well, I've never had a miscarriage, or I've only ever had good outcomes with pregnancy. Everything's gonna be fine. And I'm listening. So that in and of itself, I think, makes this process interesting. On the other hand, like imagine if you were not in good shape and you were trying to go to the gym with someone who's like a professional bodybuilder, right? Like I don't know if this is like probably not the best example I've come up with, but that's sort of what it feels like. The other piece of this is you have to create a very intense and intimate relationship with someone you just met. Mm-hmm. All right. In a very short period of time, and like build trust. Mm-hmm. That's incredibly difficult under the best of circumstances. By the way, fundraising is no different than that. You still have to build trust, right?
You have to build relationship and trust. Yep.
It's not as high, but still. And so how do you you have to think through the mechanics of how do you build trust and what parts are you willing to let go and what parts do you want to hold firm, and like go through these scenarios in your head that are like very like the hypotheticals are like where all of this lives, right? And the thing about hypotheticals is that you can't be overly committed to what you think you're going to do in a certain situation, because until you've been in it, you have no idea. Mm-hmm. So for example, when our surrogate was about to give birth, we had talked about sort of what this process was going to look like, and like we were going to be in the room and all of that. And I told him, I was like, listen, you're telling me this now because you're not in pain, you don't have contractions, and you haven't been in labor for 7 hours. Like when the time comes, just figure out a hand signal with your husband. And if we need to be out of that room because you can't deal with that many people around you, that will be okay. Like you can change your mind even as things are happening, because the hypothetical of what this is going to look like when we're all calm and this is not happening may change when you're actually in the situation. So I think that there's that part that was incredibly difficult, but it's also a beautiful journey. And I think if you open yourself up to it, you gain more, because not only now I have like this incredible baby that I get to spend so much time in, like there's just that extra level of enjoyment that you get of like all the little things so Halloween was not that long ago, and I was telling our surgeon, I was like, this is also one of those holidays that's incredibly difficult for people when they are trying to conceive and don't have any children. Mm-hmm. And because of you, I now don't have to live the trauma of surviving another Halloween without a child, right? And so that I think I get daily and constant reminders of how grateful I am that we are on the other end of that journey. But it's also like wild, and I'm very, very grateful that like most of my clients don't know this, although some do, because I got baby gifts from them, which I talk about the trust and the partnership you build with people. But it's like when you work with small businesses, you never know like what the drive is behind some of them. Mm-hmm. And what you're actually supporting. And in my case, like if it weren't for some of the clients that we've had, we wouldn't be able to be in a position where we were we're going to have Michael. And so I'm very grateful that all of that worked out.
I love that. I have so many thoughts because when you brought this up to me, I don't even know how we even came how the that conversation came up and I'm like, "Oh, I was a surrogate." And you're like, "Wait, what?" Um, and
Small world, right?
I've been dying to have someone on the other side of this
Mm.
experience to be able to like share these because my intended mother, she would never have, she was very private and I couldn't post photos and I respected that. But I would love someday for her to come on and have this conversation as like me and her. But because people don't understand, they're like, oh, you're just going to have a baby and it's fine. And like, they're like, the process of surrogacy is insane. Like you were saying, time, like it literally takes so much time. I mean, year and a half by the time you like as my side of it, like you have to apply and it's like literally like a 90-page document of everything, like how like your lifestyle, how you feel about certain things. You have to go to psych evaluations. You have to go through medical evaluations. My husband had to. Like, it is not an easy process. And then you get to the contract. Like, once you get through all of that, then you go to contract, and then there's all those conversations that no one wants to have before this experience of like, what if there's a miscarriage? What if the parents decide that they want to abort for whatever reason? I mean, like you literally have to figure out together what that's going to look like. And again, like especially not having it gone through it, you're like, I don't even know how I would feel about that.
I
It's
mean,
wild.
and, you don't really know how you're going to feel about that until you're like in the moment. Like theoretically, you may think that you feel this one way, and
Yeah.
then when things happen, it's very different. I think it's also, um, I mean, it's obviously it's a give and take, so you can't like it. All of it lives in the gray, right? Like the black and white stuff is one thing, but the other thing that like I remember, and even now, every once in a while, I would meet people, and the first question they would ask is like, "Well, were you at all worried at some point that they weren't going to give you the baby?"
Mm-hmm.
Oh,
Yeah. I'm like, no.
right.
Yeah.
But then on the other hand, um. Like I've also in the beginning I would speak with sort of lawyers who work with surrogates and they'll be like the biggest worry of surrogates is that parents weren't going to take the baby, and so it's interesting how everybody worries about the same thing but from very different angles apparently. Um,
I think the
so
biggest question I got was, are you, is it going to be hard to let go of the baby? Like, because you do
right.
create this bond, right? But that was probably the number one question for me. And I was always like, no, because literally when you go through this process, because it's such a process, literally, it's like a year process. Again, this testing, the contract, even like when you get like the transfer done, it's very transparent. Like, this is not your baby. There's something about it that like it never hit to me that way.
Well, I think it's also you have to um, take into consideration that you have whether it's an intended parent or parents and a couple or whatever the makeup of like that side of looks like you also get to walk with them and get to know them along the process. And so it's not as simple I mean, A, it's not your baby, I would agree, but also like all you have to do is look at the faces of some of those parents, especially if you've ever seen sort of pictures of what intended parents look like in the delivery room. And like all of that, I think makes it super clear. Like a picture does tell 1,000 words. I can never do it justice. I could never be able to describe the feelings you get when you see your child for the first time. Um, and I think for surrogates, it's that's part of it too. That you have to be in the headspace where you realize that you're going to impact someone's life profoundly, right? Like there is no, and like I always joke with, and I'm like, well, how am I supposed to like do birthday gifts and Christmas gifts or whatever else you're doing? Like they're like you are the reason why I have a child, and now I have to like buy you a gift for your birth. Like how is that even going to equal at all? Like there's no way, no amount of gifting is ever going to be equal, right? And so yeah, that's how I feel about it. But I also understand that um I've been on a couple of support groups with other intended mothers, and I remember one particular one that we were on, and everybody was sitting there going like, "Why are we all so type A?" And like we literally all had like, I wouldn't say similar career trajectories, but they were all kind of like replicas of each other and very intense and very scheduled people. Um, and it was interesting that we all kind of had that whole thing about how life has thrown us a curveball where the one thing that we thought we could control is actually the thing we had no control over. Now we've given it all up. And now we're trying to control just about everything else. And I was joking the other night. I was like, I am the world's like most research expert on formula. I could tell you every ingredient that's in formula because I've done months of research on that, right? Why? Because I wasn't going to be able to breastfeed myself, right? And so you try to find like different things to control, which are not the person carrying your child. And that's super difficult because that's the first place you go, right?
What I'm assuming you are still you still have a relationship with your surrogate.
Yes, I mean we do. I think we're friendly.
Yeah.
I mean, we're at the point where like I would share milestone pictures of the baby and that kind of stuff. But I think when we were sort of towards the end of the process, there was a question around how much contact
Hmm.
you want to have, and I think the scale was a 10, and we're at like 4 or 5.
Hmm.
It's what we both indicated kind of thing. And so but at this point, I think I look at it as more organic, like whatever feels right. I don't feel the pressure to communicate or not to communicate. And
Yeah.
to build out a
Well, and
life.
that's the thing too, is like those are the things you discuss. Like what is the relationship look like after? And some people don't, some surrogates don't want to have a relationship after for whatever reason. It's hard or whatnot. I was open to it. I'm with you. Like I get photos once in a while. I get Merry Christmas, Happy Birthday, Happy Mother's Day. She sends me photos. I check in. She's in Florida. She was a single mom too. And that I think that was on my end something that was super hard is she wasn't local, so I didn't like get to see her very often. But and we talked all the time, and we'd I'd video her in on appointments. But I always had to like remind myself like she would ask for photos of my tummy, or she wanted certain updates, and it was I like almost kind of forgot because I'm like I had to remind myself like this is her process too, and like she will never get to experience this, and so I was open to whatever it is that she wanted to be a part of. And some might be more hands-on and some might be less, but I'm like for me I'm like this is your journey too, and whatever it is that you need from me, I'm here to support that. um
Yeah. And it's anything goes with some of these things. And it's like I remember us talking about baby showers, I think at some point, and I was firmly on there shall be no such thing until we get the baby. No planning will happen. I literally had this whole plan how I was just going to like leave a whole bunch of money with my parents and be like, buy everything that needs to be bought, but I don't want to know about it until the baby's here, kind of thing. And then we ended up having 3 baby showers. Uh, so you have to have a level of flexibility with these things, which I think is really important in parenting too, because you just never know what kind of child you have. You may sleep through the night or he may not, right? So there's a little bit of flexibility I think needs to happen somewhere in there too.
that's so true. Was your surrogate local? Like were you able to?
No, no, ours is in Florida. See, no, and I actually think that's not entirely a bad thing
Mhm.
because so what goes through my mind this entire time, so I always have this whole process of, if I were in your shoes, what would I want? And I think that's the first step of the process. But also, because there was also distance, I think that also created space because ultimately when you're pregnant, you're a little bit cranky because you're pregnant and like it's not an easy thing physically to go through, but you also have your own family and you have to live life, right? And I don't really, and so I think if you're local, I wouldn't want to put the pressure on someone who's already pregnant to now have to socialize and do all these things with me in person because we're there. Like I
Mhm.
think if you're not local to each other, then I think that release the pressure a little bit, or at least you have to do it like virtually, which is not as big of a lift. So that there was that. I think it made the few times that we went out and the ultrasound appointments and all that that much more special.
Mhm.
Okay. So I think there's pros and cons to that. I mean, I wouldn't be opposed, but I don't think it's, yeah.
I love that. I'm glad that we're having this conversation because I actually get more people reaching out to me, not because they want to be a surrogate, but because they're in your shoes where they're at a point where they might need to have a surrogate.
Right.
And so they want, obviously, like my feedback, which I'm absolutely willing to give. But I said, you should find somebody who's gone through the process on the other end and get their feedback because it's such a different experience from my point of view to like somebody like you. And so it's interesting. So I'm glad that we're having this conversation because, like, literally, probably every couple months, I get someone that reaches out, and I'm absolutely happy to share. And I always refer my fertility clinic. They're in San Diego, fantastic. Like, still in like group chats with them, and I think that was like huge to our journey. But I mean, I feel like it's becoming more and more of a thing now. And so, like, if there's any way I can support other people, like, I'm here for it.
I think it's uh, it's good that technology has gotten to the point where this is a possibility for many more people now than it probably was, 20 years ago and 30 years ago and whatnot. I think that it's becoming more public now, which has its pluses and minuses.
Mhm.
But it's not like I want people, what I want people to know is that none of us wake up with the idea that we're going to use a surrogate to have a child. Like this is a process that took 7 years, and a lot of thinking, and I'm probably still processing, and I'll probably be processing for another 5 years, as to what that meant, and all of that. So I don't want to trivialize it because it's not like the Kardashians.
Yeah.
Definitely is not like that at all. So it's a very emotionally charged process, but I definitely don't want to trivialize it at all, because it is something that you have to be very thoughtful to get into, both as an intended parent and as a surrogate, right? It's not a quick, easy way to outsource a process.
Because you don't want to be pregnant because you don't want to get fat or like I hear some of those stories and I'm just like, ugh. And then I don't know, like I understand there's probably a lot of reasons why surrogacy is not like out publicly as much, but the few movies or the few documentaries that they do have shine such a negative light on surrogacy, like that the surrogate hooks up with the dad of the attendant. Like I just like it like I'm like this is not what it's like. And that's what bothers me the most is like can they just put a movie together that really shows like a positive experience out of it.
So I don't know about a movie, but something that was, again, when you open yourself up to some of these things, you just never know.
Yeah.
So I remember sitting on the couch one Friday night watching a Netflix special by a comedian by the name of Michelle Buteau. I don't know if you're familiar with her. You don't have to be familiar with her, but she has a show on Netflix and a couple of specials, right? And she does like her comedy thing and da 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 da. And she talks about how she has boy girl twins and whatnot. And there was a point as I'm watching this, she's like, oh, and by the way, so she just made this one joke, which I will tell the joke, and it doesn't necessarily mean I condone it, but I'm going to do it. She was like, I had a baby through surrogacy, and so when our surrogate was giving birth, I was at the bar drinking a glass of wine. So yes, you can't have it all. That was the joke that she had. But the point I was trying to make is that, and so here's this woman who's like trying to normalize this process in a like I was watching this going, I had no idea this is where this was going to go, right? But it
Yeah.
apparently it's on a Netflix special. So I hear you on, I think most people who create, first off, when has television ever given us anything that has been like super realistic portrayal of anything?
True. Very true.
Um, uh, so like why would we think that they'll do it justice this time? But also, again, it just depends. That I think it's always the case with many things is the people with the loudest voices are not necessarily the most balanced. And so the people who the stories you hear and all of that, it's usually the extremes because no newspaper is going to care about my sort of story that's middle of the road, a little bit of give and take here and there, right? That's not interesting. And so we have to be careful with these things that you only hear about the extremes, I think, on both sides. I think it's a beautiful thing. Again, it's very thoughtful and very involved process, and it's not something that's done lightly, I would say. I've never met anyone who's gone through this process and been very like lackadaisical about the whole thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I've spoken to a lot of intended parents. I haven't met that many surrogates because for various reasons, but that would be my take on it.
I love that. Thank you for having that conversation because when we connected on it, I was like, yes, can we please talk about it? Because I think from both perspectives, I think it's something worth sharing. Is there anything we didn't talk about that you would like to share with the listeners today?
Oh boy.
I
I
feel
mean,
like
I'm
we
sure
covered a lot.
there's many things.
Yeah.
We probably could. So I think all of these things have one thing in common. Like we're all humans and we all have our unique stories. And I think everybody deserves to get out of life what you put into it. And that's not always like what is it? It's like an equation that doesn't always work out, right? And I think that's also where a lot of nonprofit work comes in, right? Like with my favorite tennis player. So like one thing I didn't tell you about it in terms of hobbies, there was a thing on your intro. Like I'm a huge tennis fan. I play a lot of tennis.
Oh,
This is how I keep my sanity, right? But my favorite tennis player happened to retire last week. His name is Rafael Nadal, for those of you who watch tennis. And so in his speech, he said something along the lines of, I just want to be remembered as a good person from a small village that got a lot of opportunities in life because he was good at tennis. And it's not because I worked hard, because lots of people work hard and don't get the opportunities that I got. And I think that's really true about many things in life. And that's also where nonprofits live, is giving opportunities for people who may work really hard, may deserve the same opportunities as many of us get, but for whatever reason, the equation doesn't work out for them. And it's very fulfilling when you get to the position where you get to help these organizations scale and grow and give more people opportunities. And I think that surrogacy is no different in that you get to give, like many women have deep desires to be pregnant, and trust me, it's not for lack of trying, and it's not for lack of effort, and it's not for lack of knowledge and all of that. And sometimes the equation just doesn't work out. And people like you make that equation work out for some of us, right? And I think that's really important.
mhm. I love that. What a great way to end. Thank you so much for being here. I'm so glad we connected. I just love my little group of women who've been on the show because I feel like it's like forever friendships and we bond on so many levels. So I'm glad that you came into my network. I'm glad you were on the show. And I can't wait to continue to see your journey.
Yeah, anytime. And if you want to talk nonprofits, find me on LinkedIn. Happy to chat. And if you are an intended parent out there trying to figure out how to navigate this and you just want to get it out off your chest, I'm happy to listen to it.
I love it. Thank you so much, Mariya, for being here.
Bye now.